You're watching Public Affairs. Berkowitz is my name and politics is our game. And we will be doing lots of politics and public policy this evening because we have as our guest Bryant Jackson Green. He is, look, this guy's a criminal policy expert. He works at the Illinois Policy Institute. He's a millennial. He's 25. What's wrong with the Illinois criminal justice system?
Well, right now, Illinois prisons are incredibly overcrowded. They were built to hold about 32,000 people, but are currently holding between 47 and 48,000, which puts them at about 148 to 150% capacity.
So some would say just build more prisons, get more space, but that's not what you folks say at the Illinois Policy Institute, right?
Well, not at all. I mean, even if you thought that we need to build more prisons, Illinois doesn't have the money for it. We have a $111 billion deficit from pension underfunding, so the money's just not there. And also, a lot of people...
So the alternative is keep them crowded, let them out. Anything else we can do?
Well, I think we can reform our policies in a way that let people out in a safe way, a responsible way, to help them get back on their feet, do good by themselves and their families and the law, and actually reform people instead of just sort of warehousing them in prison, which happens too often right now.
So that's what you've been studying, right? For about how long? Because you got out of the University of Chicago about 2 years ago. We're talking about the prisons being overcrowded. We're talking about what do we want to do if we're going to get these folks out to get to a more reasonable level so they're not so overcrowded. You said you want to release them in the right way, right?
Yes.
What does that mean?
Well, if you look at the growth of Illinois' prison population, say from 1989 up until now, 55% of the growth in admissions has been Class 4 felonies. That's the lowest level felony. And most of those people admitted are there for nonviolent drug offenses. So
typically, let me slow you down.
Yes.
Those Class 4 felons, when you say typically that's nonviolent drug offenses, and what was the percentage you gave? Half of these Class 4 felons are nonviolent crimes, or half of them are all nonviolent crimes? What's the percentage?
Most of them. So for the prison population as a whole, 45% are there for nonviolent offenses.
Nonviolent, which means what? Give that definition.
That means crimes that that don't involve the use of violence or threat of violence. That basically means drug crimes and property crimes.
Are these mostly drug possession crimes, or are they also drug sales?
The lower level, so Class 4, they'll often be possession. Usually if you're a drug dealer, you get a higher felony class.
And so you're focusing on Class 4 felons, right? Or Class 4 felons or less?
We're really focusing on everyone.
Everyone. So if somebody's in for like selling drugs, are they included in what you're talking about?
So it depends on what they're charged for. So that might be, the highest charge they get, but often, drug dealing may involve violence. So many of these people aren't there just for that if they're in the drug trade business.
Your focus is on the nonviolent drug offenders and looking to see whether, for public policy purposes, it would be better to get shorter sentences and get these folks out of the prison.
Yes.
Am I getting that right?
Absolutely.
Are their sentences too lengthy to begin with? The nonviolent drug crimes, do you think?
Yes, in many cases, people who suffer from drug addiction may not even need to go to prison. What we should be doing is placing them in drug treatment programs, which cost thousands of dollars less than incarceration, but actually get at the root cause of crime for these people. Which is a drug addiction, in many cases mental health troubles, causing them to commit offenses.
So if you could give them a sentence suspended and put them out on parole, and that would mean what? If they had another conviction or another arrest, then they would be a parole violator, and then you could keep bringing them back in prison. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Well,
I mean, you're not saying you want to do that, but there's always that check. People might say, well, do you have a check? That's one check. Worst case scenario, you can bring them in, or maybe you can more closely supervise. Well, what do you do? Okay, look, I don't mean to keep interrupting, but say you've done what you say. Say you reduce sentences. In some cases, you might have before put them in prison for 2 years. Maybe under your advice, you would put them on parole for 3 years, a longer period, but not severely in prison. Mm-hmm. Say you did that. What does that parole look like in your mind? What are they doing for those 3 years when they're under parole? That person is no longer going to prison, but is still perhaps a marijuana user, perhaps are we discriminating? Could they be a marijuana user? Could they be using heroin? Could they use crack cocaine? All of those would be nonviolent offenses, right?
Yes, that's right. So under these circumstances, if they're suffering from a drug addiction problem, we want them to get treatment. We want them to become clean if that's what's causing them to commit crime. But as far as parole goes, swift and certain sanctions I think is something that's become popular over the past few years. So it means that if someone commits a violation of conditions of parole, what some states like South Dakota do for drunk drivers is, they have them stay in jail for a short period of time, 1 or 2 days, just to teach them a lesson, and then put them back. And that's a lot more effective, just sort of, regular punishments and rewards, because right now what happens too often is that there's really no response from the parole system until the 10th offense, and they're sent straight back to prison. So constant feedback is really a good way to incorporate, punishments, sort of using economic policy.
And is checking in with a parole officer an important feature of parole?
Yes, especially if you suffer from alcoholism or other kind of drug addiction.
And how often do you think they ought to check in? Once a week, once a month? What's recommended? In the scenario I gave you, somebody who's fairly severely addicted, we've put them on 3 years parole, they didn't do any prison time. What should they be doing in terms of parole? Once a week, once a month? What do you say?
I would say daily.
Daily? Mm-hmm. For how long would you do that daily?
It depends on the offense, but say for people who have DUIs, daily is the model that they've been doing in South Dakota.
What about Illinois? Do we have anything like this in Illinois?
Well, we do
anything like what I just described to you?
Nothing quite that involved. I mean, we do have parole, of course, but it's not something people don't always check in daily.
What's the drug of choice here?
It's generally speaking, like higher level drugs, things like cocaine, things like heroin, which Illinois has epidemic of right now.
Cocaine,
crack.
Okay, so you got a cocaine user,
meth.
You got a heroin user, you got a meth user. What would you say? How frequently would you put them on parole if you gave them 3 years parole initially? Daily?
For check-ins, yes, that might be.
Okay, so you would do it daily. What's the closest we have to that currently in Illinois? Whether you look at Cook County, Will County, Lake County, pick just any. What's your best guess as to how frequently would somebody say, okay, if we do that, we just don't have a budget for that, so we're going to give them weekly parole? Or would some people say, yeah, we can do daily parole?
Mm-hmm. Well, if they're in a drug court program, which deals with these issues specifically, then it's my understanding that it's a lot more frequent of a check-in. So
is it daily?
It's not daily in Illinois.
What is it in Illinois?
Usually weekly.
So
some weekly or monthly.
So if there are legislators out there, or what's that? The Illinois Commission on Criminal Justice Reform, right?
Yes.
Appointed by Rauner in March. They had a report in July, right?
Yes.
20 or 25 people, including legislators. If they're watching, they should be listening to you. Say maybe that commission should be studying what you're talking about, daily use, because we're not daily parole, daily check-ins, because we're not doing any of that part.
No.
And we should.
Definitely. For a lot of offenses, not even just drug offenses, but it might be helpful for property offenses too that are nonviolent.
So like Scott Drury, who's a state rep, you know him, right? He's on that commission up here in Highland Park. Scott, we've asked you to be on the show. Out there, Brian Jackson Green's here. So you seriously come on the show and we'll see how that's playing with Scott Drury, right? Or Mike Connolly out in the western suburbs. Or my good friend Kwame Raoul, state senator from the south side of Bass, come on the show. He's a very good role model in that sense. But seriously, so all these folks should be listening because that's where the rubber hits the road, right? The state legislature.
Yeah, and the commission.
They're the guys who write the laws, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're going to change anything, you got to change their minds, and you got the leaders, right? Like Speaker Mike Madigan, his daughter, Attorney General Lisa Madigan, Senate President John Collerton, Republican Senate Leader Redonio, Republican House Leader Durkin. Aren't these are the movers and the shakers in this area? If you change their minds, Speaker Mike could pass your bill that you'd recommend just like that, right?
Absolutely. So the commission that you mentioned before is going to be releasing the proposals in December, but then it really just moves on to our political leaders to take action, to pass laws and make these changes.
In December of 2015, that report's out and goes to the leaders?
Yes.
I mean, to the whole General Assembly, right?
Yes, to the public.
To the public, but also to the General Assembly. So conceivably, if the commission goes your way, or at least the way we're discussing here, some of these changes could be made in the regular session, which is January to May of 2016, right?
Yes, that's the hope.
That's the hope. Okay, so keep going more. So we're doing these daily parole check-ins. After maybe 3 or 4 months, we start reducing them to weekly. Is that ideally what we do?
Well, nature of drug addiction certainly varies, so it really needs to be targeted towards individual needs. The whole point of reform, or I guess a major thrust of reform, is sort of right-sizing treatment something that's appropriate for each individual offender instead of a one-size-fits-all model, which fails too many. Right now, we have 45% of our prison population returning within 3 years with their recidivism rate. So by targeting treatment in a way that addresses the individual challenges that every inmate faces, it should be we should have an easier time of informing them, getting them back on their feet, helping them find work when they get out, which is a big problem, and staying out of the criminal justice system altogether.
So you just kind of outlined a whole schematic to improve criminal justice administration in Illinois, right? So we've been talking about maybe putting people more on parole rather than in prison, right?
Yes.
Because prisons, to some extent, are like schools to learn how to become, criminals, right? So if we can keep people out and deal with their core problem and do it with either mental health treatment or drug treatment or whatever, well, then they're getting rehabilitated and dealt with their core problem. But to do that, we got to get away from these mandatory sentences, would you say?
Yes, absolutely.
Why? What's wrong? Because people say, look, we had discretion, too many criminals in general were being let loose way too early. For some reason, judges were too lenient. So they came up with these mandatory minimums to make sure judges didn't abuse their discretion and people who did, really heinous crimes went to jail. What's wrong with that theory?
Well, the problem with mandatory minimums is that it takes out the role of, context for an offense. Is this someone's first offense, and for what sort of crime? What's the context that really explains why they committed this particular offense? In drug crimes, we have people in some states who are serving 55-year sentences for simple marijuana sales, which is insane. Right. In many cases, they have higher sentences than someone would get for child molestation, for terrorism, and for homicide. So you really have to think, are the sentences we're imposing proportional for what actually occurred?
So what should it be for somebody who's selling marijuana? If you were king, what would you do? What would you recommend they do? Should there be a range, and what should it be? Because we've said of many of these folks who are possession and users, they probably best dealt with without prison time, possibly. What about sellers? The same thing?
Well, and we definitely don't want low-level offenders for marijuana use in prison at all, because that's a
even if they're
trade.
even if they're selling drugs, not just possession, but they're selling. Maybe they're hanging around schools. Maybe they're trying to get kids, hooked, and then they become their regular customers. Some of that might happen, right? Mm-hmm. Say they're doing that. Say you have evidence of that. Mm-hmm. Would you still say we don't want those people going to jail?
Well, some short prison term might make sense, but
like what? What would be a short prison term?
Probably, I wouldn't imagine anything more than a Class 4 felony.
Which would be
usually between 1 and 3 years.
Okay, so maybe 1 to 3 years for selling, right?
Perhaps, but you really have to think about, given that we have limited criminal justice resources, do we want police going after these people, or do we going them after people committing homicides, people in gangs committing assaults,
so
terrorizing neighborhoods?
Whole another subject. Maybe we should just legalize this stuff and get. You study Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago.
Yes.
Libertarian, This is a nonviolent crime. It's a victimless crime in many cases. Two individuals want to transact, one wants to sell, one wants to buy. Who's hurt? Can't really stop it. Let's just legalize it. Slight digression. Would you be okay with that?
Well, even if you aren't necessarily for or against legalization, I think the major change coming right now is that people should not all be in prison for this sort of crime. A ticket would maybe make sense. And be much more cost effective. Something
more like alcohol abuse. We don't make it illegal to drink alcohol. Why should we make it illegal to do drugs, right?
And in that case, if it's alcohol abuse or any sort of substance abuse is causing you to commit crime, then the state can intervene to stop that.
Okay, so we've covered sort of that on the sellers. We've dealt with sort of those issues, and we've dealt with mandatory minimums and the problems they cause. As you've talked about tailoring the sentence to the individual. If you have a mandatory minimum, the judge can't do that. Right? He can in terms of how high he goes, but he can't tailor it lower, right?
No, and many federal judges have come out against this, apologizing to the people they sentenced, saying, "I know this is unfair."
Federal judges.
Yes.
What about the circuit court? Because we got a lot of this. A lot of this is, in terms of possession, is probably more state crimes than federal, right?
Generally speaking. So the bulk of the...
So what about the circuit court judges? Would they say, yeah, they'd like more discretion too?
There have been some, many judges, and certainly op-eds and other in conversations, publicly and privately, have expressed some reluctance to sentence people very harshly.
And those judges and their administrative officials are represented on this Illinois Commission for criminal justice reform, right?
Yes, there are some retired
We have
judges.
legislators, we have retired judges, we have people from the jails, from the prisons, the whole gamut, right?
Yes.
Democrat, Republican, so forth.
It's a very bipartisan effort.
Why is it bad to give somebody a felony conviction for a $500 theft?
Well, the problem is just inflation, so as there's natural inflation.
You want to adjust for inflation.
Yeah, so there's just...
The only policy is up, and you learn that from University of Chicago. We should always adjust for inflation, right? From Milton Friedman on, right?
Absolutely, because the problem is that it becomes much more punitive over time when a statute is written.
So adjust for
10 years
inflation,
ago.
but also you might want to have it lower, because once somebody gets a felony on his or her record, it's kind of a more major issue for getting a job. And we do want people to come out of, as you say, 90% of the people in prison are coming out sometime, right?
Yes.
So we want them to be able to get a job, because if not, they're going to return to a life of crime. And if you have a felony conviction, it's a little harder, right?
Yeah. Ex-offenders will tell you, if you talk to them, that the biggest factor that deters them from recommitting crime is whether or not they're able to find employment. And of course, the Illinois Constitution requires that people are being restored to useful citizenship once they're released. So we want people to find jobs, we want them to support themselves, and stay off welfare and away from crime.
And we have these laws against licensing that are also a barrier for these people getting jobs, because say they had a low-level marijuana conviction, they might not be able to go ahead and become a hairstylist or a barber or a geologist or any one of a number of things that seem completely unrelated to the crime, number one. And two, even if it's related, do we want to really bar these people from working in all these occupations? That's the point you make in your report, right?
Certainly, in the
In
ironic
Illinois,
thing-
how many professions do we have? You have to get a license before you can enter that profession.
Oh, in Illinois, certainly many hundreds.
Many hundreds.
Yes.
Involving things like, I didn't know the state needed to highly regulate who could cut my hair. Maybe the free market could work there. Maybe I could decide who's good.
Interior designers, another one.
Another one. Okay, so these people seriously are barred from a lot of things. So we got to go to the legislators to say, look, you should de-license a lot of these things. And you know you'll have problems, because a lot of it isn't to do with crime. If you're a barber, you would like to have fewer barbers competing with you. So if you got a license, make sure nobody else gets one, right?
By limiting entry, you can charge higher prices for your services.
So you're sort of viewed as a conservative organization. I don't know if John would like that. He would say liberty, free market oriented. Some would say you're conservative. But then you get liberals who actually have similar ideas. They're in accord with you, guys and ladies, in terms of they would like to have fewer mandatory sentences. They would like to focus on mental health and drug treatment issues. They would like to do many of the same things you're trying to do, right?
Yes, on criminal justice policy, you see strange alliances in that people as diverse as Rand Paul and President Obama largely agree on the same thing. They're putting too many people in prison for nonviolent offenses, pointing out that the U.S. Leads the world in incarceration rate and in absolute incarceration numbers, outdoing even nations like China, which are hardly friends of freedom and liberty.
And then Rand Paul, you mentioned, he's also, in sync with this, because he talks about the Sixth Amendment, which says, in all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial. Speedy. So Rand, people who see our regular show, you can find our shows of a week or two ago on youtube.com/publicaffairs.tv. You can see Rand was out, Rand Paul was there in the aisles, talking about the Sixth Amendment, talking about people in the inner cities across the country languishing in jails and prisons, often for years before they get a trial. One, he gave an example of some young minority who never got to a trial after a few years committed suicide. So especially minorities, especially Hispanics and blacks, they're obviously whites, especially low-income whites in these similar situations, some maybe not so low-income. But it does hit minorities more for a variety of reasons, which he explains there, which I won't go into. But so this would be, and Democrats and liberals try to say they focus on minority rights, constitutional rights. This truly is an idea whose time has come, right?
Definitely. I mean, just pointing out the absurdity of someone languishing in jail because they can't pay $500 in bail to get out. And in the case that Rand Paul was discussing, someone sitting in Rikers for 3 years, accused of stealing a backpack, but never actually convicted of this crime.
Okay, so I mean, this is something like Senate President John Cullerton. Good, he's been on public affairs. We hope he comes back soon. I mean, we'd like to ask him because he's a liberal, his liberal credentials are strong, and he's a good guy. He should be, as Senate President, he could do so much on this issue. And I'm sure, we don't know, we haven't talked to him, he's likely to agree with you, right?
I hope so.
All right.
On the policy side, you definitely see groups as diverse as, say us and the ACLU and pretty much anyone on the political spectrum pushing for reform. So the time has come in Illinois.
All right, and so you mentioned bail. Bail shouldn't be used to keep people in prison because you think they're bad guys because they haven't had their trial yet. Bail is to set an amount to make sure they're likely to appear. So it shouldn't be punitive. It should be about, give them an incentive to appear so they won't lose what they put up for bail. But some people just say, okay, bail's a good way to make sure that they stay in prison. That would be an abuse of the system, right?
Yes, and I mean, if you're a violent offender who just happens to have a lot of money, it doesn't stop you at all from doing anything.
And, okay, so what's the core thing? Because we've been talking about this for a while. Well, also, we haven't really spent enough time on helping people get jobs. So they come out of the system, as Danny Davis says, Congressman Danny Davis, another former guest of Public Affairs. Danny, we haven't seen you in a while. We'll have to have you back. But he does talk about second chance, repeat offenders, or maybe ex-offenders, excuse me, but giving them a second chance so they don't become repeat offenders, right?
Yes. And that also goes back to the licensing issue because the Department of Corrections even has training programs for barbers, nail technicians, cosmetologists, and when they get out of prison, they can't get that job because they can't get a license.
Yeah, I mean, some people say, well, look, they get asked if they were ever convicted of a crime, they put that down on their form, then they're immediately not considered. Is that a fair question to put down on there? Some states have intervened and said you can't ask that. What do you say about that?
Well, we understand, the interest that, business owners have in making sure that they're hiring reliable employees and the concerns they have. But on the other hand, when you think of someone's punishment when they're sentenced, when they commit a crime, they're sentenced to prison to serve a term. They're put on parole, sometimes probation, and that's really what we think of as their punishment. We don't really think of their punishment as being the scarlet letter that follows you around for the rest of your life, keeping you out of work, and in many ways keeping you out of achieving the American dream.
So we might think of ways that, without interfering too much with the free market, would incentivize employers to give folks a second chance. Maybe just more educational, just reminding people, look, this is something they've done their time. Most of these people, we believe, we spent a long time rehabilitating them. We spent a long time trying to have them out on parole so that they got the treatment they need. We think they're ready. Maybe almost give them like something the equivalent of a diploma, a reminder to employers. And in our view, we've checked this person, this young lady, this young man, and they are fine. They are ready to work. They're committed. They're not doing drugs, something like that.
Yeah.
Maybe we could be more proactive in saying, we understand the problem, we understand your reluctance, but I think you're getting a good deal if you hire this person.
Absolutely. Given that 62% of Illinois prisoners have at least one child, if you can't support yourself through legal means, through honest work, then of course it makes it much more attractive to turn back to the legal means to support yourself and your family. Yeah,
and so we just want to take a slight digression to education. Well, it's not, because there is the issue is, should we do more to educate the prisoners? Because we have, to varying degree in Illinois, do we have programs where prisoners in Illinois can get their GED, can maybe even get a college degree, so when they come out, again, they're better equipped to work, and they're more likely to work because they have the requisite training. Do we do any of that in Illinois now?
Some, but it just depends on what funding is available each year. Right now, Illinois in prisons, I think about 30% of people have a high school diploma. Only 30%.
Have the degree. Did they get that in prison, or they had that before?
Sometimes in prison through GED programs, sometimes beforehand.
But what do we do to make that available, to promote it? Are we doing enough? Is it a budget issue, or is it some other issue why it's not happening?
Well, part of it is budget, and I think that by cutting back on our prison population, by preventing people who don't need to be there from being there in the first place, then the state will have more money, certainly both for taxpayers, but also to have these education programs.
To offer that to the parolees, because what does it cost to house an individual, to put him or her in prison for a year?
Right now, $22,000, and when you add in the cost of pensions and health care for employees and capital cost for facilities, it costs up to $38,000.
It's like sending a kid to Harvard, maybe more expensive, right? Or a better school, University of Chicago or Northwestern, right? So seriously, you could save $40,000 because you're not putting that person in prison, that can pay for a lot of treatment, mental health, drug treatment, and it can pay for, here's an incentive for you to get your GED. Look, you get your GED, you can come see me less often. I'm more confident. Because we haven't talked about that. There's a lot of, when that commission is studying things, they're trying to talk about risk analysis. What's the risk of this person reoffending? So if they've been in prison for 2 years or 3 years and they're putting them on parole, you don't want them going out of prison without any parole. You want to have some way of monitoring and being there sort of as a friend as well to help that person deal with life on the outside, right?
Yeah, you need people to transition, not going straight from prison to the outside where they very often fail, but having some sort of supervision to help them make that change from freedom, from imprisonment to freedom.
Right, and the last thing, we're going to have to wrap up soon, but the last thing, and it is a bit of a digression, but maybe not so, school choice, right? Kids learn early on how to commit crimes. They may not get caught till later on. They may go through the juvenile delinquency system. But if kids don't learn how to read, aren't they more likely to join a gang?
Absolutely.
And in fourth grade, if they don't learn how to read as young as that, we see kids 9, 10, 11 in the Chicago area dropping out of the Chicago public schools. Maybe they're not learning how to read. Maybe that makes sense if you're not. Joining a gang, and then the gang members send them, look, you're young, you're not going to have to do much time. You do the shooting, right?
Well, a large part of the reform will actually have to focus on education, and early, not when people are already in prison. It starts from early childhood all the way through high school.
So is the Illinois Policy Institute a believer? What would be the most important thing in your mind and the Illinois Policy Institute's mind that could be done to improve the quality of education in CPS, Chicago Public Schools?
Really, school choice. Inner city schools are failing too many students right now and putting them on the wrong path and away from success. But just having, families having the ability to choose what school their child goes to, if it's a good public school or a charter school, private or parochial school, would be a big way to empower low-income parents to make it better.
Say it again. What are those choices that you'd like to see them have?
Say vouchers, for instance, the opportunity to go to public school if it's good, a private school, parochial, whatever option fits best for you, fits best for your child and your family.
In a charter school, which is sort of a hybrid, but it is a public school.
Yes.
But it's released from a lot of the constraints and regulations that might hamper traditional neighborhood schools, so they can cater more to the market needs of individuals, right?
Schools that are allowed to innovate instead of putting a one-size-fits-all model, which happens in too many of our schools right now.
So what do we need? What's the one key word? You mentioned innovation. What's the most important thing to radically change education?
Choice.
Choice, because choice gives you competition, right? And that's really what I think the Illinois Policy Institute's a lot about that. If producers can compete and say, here's the best way we think to teach kids in fourth grade how to read. Somebody says, no, here's a better way. Let people experiment, let people try. We're failing. Only about 25% of the kids in fourth grade who are black or Hispanic read at grade level in CPS. So people say, well, we don't want to experiment. If 1 out of 4 kids you're succeeding with and 3 out of 4 you're not, are you really afraid that you're going to knock that down to 20%? We should be innovating and experimenting, and that's really the right word, coming up with new methods so we can ratchet that up from 25% to 50 or 75% or 100%, right?
That's where it needs to start, yes.
All right. I mean, so anything that we haven't covered in the last minute or so that you would like to cover in the next minute about criminal justice reform? What have we left out? Or have we kind of hit the whole gamut?
I think we've touched over everything broadly, but I just want to reemphasize how this is not just a liberal issue, it's not just a conservative issue, it's something that everyone should be able to see the advantages for. Whether you're motivated by social justice or just fiscal, budgetary concerns. Reform can actually save us money, make communities safer, and improve lives.
Can they follow you specifically? Do you tweet?
Yes, I do. Not very often, I do. My handle is at Bryant, BRYANTJG.
Okay, and so that's Bryant Jackson Green, right?
Yes.
Thank you so much. That's our handle right here. And so you remember our handle every week you come back to public affairs.